Good evening. It's Lag BaOmer tonight, and that's why we're in the Beit Midrash studying because there's nothing better to do. There's no mitzvot today. There's no kiyum of minhag. Yeah, people make bonfires, but it's strictly non-Talmudic. So, I guess a change of pace. Whereas last week we stuck with Talmudic, Mishnaic, halachic sources, today we're going to mostly discuss biblical sources. Why? Because even though halacha is how we're supposed to live our lives, we're supposed to be aware of the halacha, how the halacha is derived, so that we can know what to do and what not to do. Strictly follow the rule, the letter of the law. We must also understand the spirit of the law, and that is gained by studying the pshat of the biblical narratives. If anything's recorded in the Bible, it's because there's an eternal lesson there. Sometimes it's an eternal lesson about how one should behave by looking at the behavior of classical figures brought up in the Bible. And sometimes it's a good lesson in national behavior. So let's look at a rather cryptic passage. Not cryptic because it has difficult words, because it prophesies something of the future necessarily. Let's say the types of passages we find in latter parts of the books of Yechezkel, Ezekiel, or Zechariah, for example. This is a story of what happened when Yerovam first initiated his alternative temples. It says he created new holidays, new place of worship, so that the Jewish people would not want to return to Jerusalem. And as I've said many times, this is the basis for policies that continue until today, let's say by the modern Israeli regimes, that do not allow mass pilgrimage to the temple. It certainly do not want the reinstitution of the temple service, and instead create alternatives for the people in order to, I guess, prop up their own tenuous grasp on political power. And let's say the holiday of Lag BaOmer, with its place of pilgrimage rivaling that of Jerusalem, speaking of Meron, is a fitting example. It's Yerovam couldn't come up with something better himself. And it says that a prophet from Yehuda, an Ish Elohim, which is a Targum Yonathan always says it means a prophet, came from Yehuda. That means the kingdom to the south, just over the border actually, because this is in Beit El. And he came and rebuked Yerovam. And it's a very strange message here, that afterwards, after he decried what Yerovam was doing, and his prediction came true, the altar was torn asunder, and the ashes thereon were spilled. It was quite an impressive feat that his prophecy came true right then and there, as a prophecy of the future. That which he predicted well into the future did not yet come to pass. Obviously, it took a few hundred years for that to happen. And the strange thing is that he then declines an invitation from Yerovam himself, the man whom he had just rebuked, to come join him for some food. And the prophet said that he had been commanded by God not to eat bread. Bread is usually the general term for eat food, or to drink water in this place. It means, I guess, in throughout Yerovam's new kingdom. And he was told, I can't do this. That's what God said. And also, he's not supposed to come back the way he came. Now, the question is, what is the purpose of this commandment? Just obviously, God didn't just want to make this Navi's job harder. It's strange that the Navi was told to don't eat, don't drink. Moses was not told not to eat and not to drink. He just happened not to eat and drink when he was up on Sinai. But for whatever reason, this prophet, by the way, is anonymous. We have said earlier that even though the Midrash and the Gemara say that he is identified with the prophet Ido or Yedo, who is mentioned a few times in Tanakh, but we don't know whatever he said. So, and he was around this time, so the sages say it must have been this is Ido and Yedo, the one who remained anonymous here. Except that we saw that based on the Psukim and Divrei Yamim, this could not be Ido and Yedo, who lived well past this point, and this is going to result in this prophet's death. And we have to ask ourselves this question: why would God command this prophet such a thing? What is the purpose of all this? And it gets even stranger because then we read about how there was an old Navi. The text over here calls him a Zaken. He's old, or an elder. Whereas Targum Yonathan, the official translation of this text, adds the word Navi Echad Sheker, Navi Sheker. He was a false prophet. It identifies it quickly. We could have gotten that he's a false prophet, by the way, because when he goes to speak to this true prophet, it says Kicheshlo. He tricked him. This false prophet comes to the true prophet after hearing what he did, intercepts him on his way back, and says, "You may have been told by God not to eat and drink while you are here, but I have a matter of God came to me. See, that's what he'd been told. He says, Gam ani navi. I'm also a prophet, kamocha, just like you. Umalachti beri lai b'dvar Hashem lemor. An angel told me in the word of God, saying, Hashiveu techal beithecha. Take him back to your house, ve'ochal lechem v'yesh mayim, and he shall eat bread and drink some water. So he tricked him. Now, then it says here that this prophet was then given a message from God once he's sit there. It said they were sitting at the table. I guess he was eating. See, he says he was eating with him. And God told him, you didn't listen to me. I gave you this commandment, and you did not listen. Now you shall not be brought to burial with your fathers. So that's pretty unfortunate that he was tricked into this navi. Now he's going to have to pay with his life. Also, interestingly enough, this second prophet is unnamed. He's anonymous. And there's quite a few midrashim attempting to identify who this was. There's various ones. We're not going to get into that. That's not the point here. So the question now is, why is it that this navi was allowed to be tricked? Why did this false prophet wish to trick him also? Why is it so important to have to go and bring about this fellow's death? How do you trick him? And this navi, I think if someone is on a high enough level to become a prophet of God, then he would at least have the sense to know who's tricking him and when not to disobey the Lord. So it brings up a few questions. And when we think about it, we could offer a few answers. The first is that when God tells him not to eat and drink on his way and then not go back the way he came, basically, this is a way of avoiding contact with people. He's basically told, don't have social contact with people. Like they used to during the China virus times, they'd say, you can't eat and drink with anybody, stay away from everybody, socially distance. And as we know, the true purpose of social distancing is to keep people away from each other, literally. It wasn't just like to prevent the spread of disease, it's just to, keep people away. But in this case, it helps him to be socially distanced. Why? Because this is a place that is becoming corrupted. Like the Midrash says, Yeravam was able to get away with his so-called innovations because he had the support of the religious establishment. Even the true prophet Machon Shilo had his name affixed to a proclamation, basically giving a stamp of approval, a hechsher, to what Yeravam was now going to do, a replacement holiday in a replacement shrine. And that was a problem. But Yeravam couldn't have done this without support by people who looked like the religious establishment, elders and prophets, basically the rabbinic establishment of that time and place. So this Navi has been told, stay away from this because they have already become corrupted. And that's why I believe the Hebrew for this false prophet says Azaken. He was someone who traded in his reputation as perhaps being someone who you would have thought as a Navi. Certainly, this true Navi could not tell the difference. Like you have people in rabbinic garb. They walk the walk and they talk the talk. You have large yarmulkes, the beards and everything. But perhaps they're just frauds inside. And that's what this guy is. He looks like a Navi. He knows how to talk it. He even has a reputation for being such. He's one of Yeravam's yes men. And it's true. He decides that perhaps to shore up his own reputation, to show that he's legit, to get some cred, basically, he's showing that he's bringing this Navi to eat with him. That could really give him some, some good publicity, or as a proof that he is on the up and up. And also it helps that he's perhaps, if he's sinister in this respect, maybe he's not just trying to help himself, but actually trying to undermine the true prophets who are opposed to Ravam by showing that, no, you could get this guy, this Navi, to violate his own commands. He's told the king. I'm sure other people heard this. He told the king himself, I'm not allowed to eat here. I'm not supposed to be drinking here. And then this Navi comes and shows, this false Navi comes and shows that this real Navi is eating and drinking here. Shows that this Navi himself, this true one, does not believe in his own words, or maybe he himself can be swayed. And that's why he is deserving of death. Why did Hashem bring this about? Uh, I guess, well, I wouldn't guess because I don't want to say anything bad about anybody, but obviously, divine justice is such that it is perfect, and it made the decision that whatever this Navi had done was deserving. But why did he fall into the ability? Why did he become tricked? Because he himself had allowed himself to be tricked. He had gone to the land of Ephraim. He had left land of Yehuda, went north to Ephraim, and perhaps thought that there is something redeemable there. Perhaps he had the thought that he would try to persuade others to join him. And the point was that no, he can't do such a thing. He's supposed to stay strictly away from everybody. And because he was wavering in his faith, he was not fully committed, God brought this about, that he was tricked into this situation. That's as far as I could see. So what's the lesson here? Well, the first lesson is that in order for a regime to be able to get away with these crimes against God, replacing the temple, replacing the holidays, trying to get the Jewish people to be distant from the true worship of God, requires collaborators, specifically collaborators from the religious establishment. And we have to watch out for those types because there are many. Sometimes they're in the majority, as we shall soon see. And sometimes they could pass themselves off as such legitimate people, even though they're not, that even prophets can be tricked by them. That's the eternal lesson here. Now, why did I say they could be in the majority? A few years later, let's do a quick calculation. This is in the middle of Yerovam's reign. I don't know, I guess by my calculations, about 50 something years later, close to 60, there's already been 2 regime changes among the 10 tribes. This is now in the days of, if this happened in the days of Rechavam, who is the son of Shlomo HaMelech, then Yehoshaphat would be his great-grandson. In his great-grandson days, the king of Israel was Ahab, who was incredibly evil. He was the worst of all of those who preceded him. And for whatever reason, shortly before his own death, he decided it would be a good idea to wage war against the Aramean kingdom. That was their constant enemy since the times of Yehoshaphat's father, Asa, who basically incited the Arameans against the 10 tribes. Perhaps that was safe to say that was a great mistake that he did. And the 10 tribes could not be rid of these Aramean invaders and rivals for the next 1.5 centuries or so, up to 2 centuries later, until they're both the Israelites and the Arameans were conquered by the Assyrians and taken into exile. So that was a problem. They basically brought it on themselves. But here, Ahab has decided that they have to retake some territory that they've lost to Aram. And he invited Yehoshaphat, the king of Yehuda, to join him in battle. And Yehoshaphat agreed, but perhaps Yehoshaphat realized his agreement was made in haste. And then he proposed to Achav that they consult with the Nevi'im. And here it says, like boats Melech Yisrael et HaNevi'im. Yehoshaphat first said, let's seek out what God has to say. So the king of Israel, that would be Ahab, gathered to him 400 men. Okay, the prophets, 400 prophets, pretty good. Vayomer Alihem, he told them, Ha'elech al Ramot Gilad lamilchama yimechdal. He asked them, should I go to war against Ramot Gilad, or should I desist? Vayomru aleh, so they told him, ascend. V'yitain Adonai biyad hamelech. And the Lord, literally the Lord here, because spelled with Shem Adnut, shall give them into the king's hand. So Yehoshaphat didn't accept this. Vayom Yehoshaphat, ha'in po Davi Lashem od. Perhaps there's but one more prophet of God. Here it says God's actual name, as it's supposed to be written. Let's seek out from him also. Yehoshaphat is not convinced by these 400 Nevi'im. Why is it? What tipped him off that he should not be listening to these Nevi'im? So the king of Israel told him, well, I know of one more prophet around, not Eliyahu, for whatever reason. All these stories Basically, it rotates. First, it's Eliyahu chastises Ahab, and then an anonymous prophet they identify as the same one, Bichaihu, and then Eliyahu shows back up again, and then he's gone, and now it's Bichaihu actually mentioned by name. And the next story is going to have Eliyahu show up again. So Ahab had his hands full of these opposing prophets, and Michaihu is summoned, and the Saris, Echad, one, literally it's a eunuch, but sometimes it's just a servant of some stature, was told to go get this Michaihu, hurry up and get him. And they were sitting there, and these prophets, don't call them false yet, but we'll see that they are false. Targum Yonasan calls them false, of course. And they were prophesying before them, and this Tzidkiah ben Kena'anah made himself some iron horns, and he demonstrated with them, as the prophets would do, these iron horns. With these horns, you're going to gore or smite the Arameans until you so totally get rid of them. Nagach is shall you smite. And it says, Kol Nevi'im Kain Lemor. And all the prophets were prophesying likewise, saying, Alei Ramot Gilad Vatzlach, go up to Ramot Gilad and be successful. Here it says the Lord's actual name. God will give them to your hands. So that was something suspicious. Meanwhile, the Malach now calls a Sarisa, an emissary, who went to call Michaihu, told him, all the prophets are speaking as one mouth in a manner that is good for the king. You should also speak like they do. And Michaihu says, Chas v'shalom, by the life of the Lord, I'm only going to say that which God actually tells me. He goes there, he tells Ahab, yeah, Alei Vatzlach. And Ahab says, I adjure you have to swear to me, you're going to tell me what it really is. And Michaihu gives it to him and says, yeah, this is part of a pretext. God is trying to incite you, bring about your own demise, because you're deserving of death. You've done way too much, and now your time has come. But the Jewish people will survive this. So the question is, what tipped off Yehoshaphat that he knew that these prophets are all false? And the key is over here in what this emissary tells the true prophet. They're all speaking the same. They're all saying yes. They're all saying tov, and they're pe'echad. This is the key to false prophets. They all say the same thing, and they all say the right thing. They're yes men. They confirm what the regime wants to hear. Think about it. When you have a pashkevil, about a rabbinic declaration about something, if it's something frivolous and the type of thing that you should not be listening to, then signatures become a dime a dozen, and also pretty quickly. They get hundreds. They get as many as they need very quickly. And we remember also, thank God, we've now had a lot of practical experience in the last 2 years of the herd mentality, especially how figures who have some influence, celebrities and rabbinic figures, lahavdil, are able to suddenly all jump on one wagon because that's what the regime wants to say. And we're too familiar with these incidences. That was the tip-off. That's how Yehoshaphat knew that these prophets were false. Sages tell us that no two prophets speak in the same style. So if they're all saying the same thing, they all sound suspiciously similar, it's because they're a bunch of frauds. And that's a stark lesson for the rest of us. So you have to watch out. Yes, men of one mouth. It's quite clear that this is what it's trying to teach us as an eternal lesson. There's something else here that should go mentioned. It says in 2 Kings 3:13, after Achav died, his son Ahaziah became king. Ahaziah did not last too long. Eliyahu Navi prophesied his own death because he himself took ill. This Ahaziah took ill shortly after taking the throne, and instead of consulting with God, sent his own emissaries to consult with Beelzebub, Baal Zevuv, the god of Ekron. And Eliyahu Navi basically declared, because this guy is so lacking in faith, such a continuation of his father and mother's disgusting habits, that he is to die. And his successor was his younger brother, Yehoram. Yehoram became king, and he was not as bad as his father. He was just another Yeravam ben Nevat. It's said to his credit or to his discredit, however it may be. And he also invited Yehoshaphat out to war. Shortly after Achav died, the Moabites, who had been paying Ahab a handsome tribute on a yearly basis, rebelled. They wanted their independence, and Yehoram wanted to quell this rebellion. and he took along the king of Judah and his own puppet king. The Judeans at the time ruled over Edom, the Edomian ruler. And eventually they found themselves in a little bit of a predicament. They needed to consult the prophet, and they had been told by some of their men that for whatever reason, Elisha Navi, Eliyahu's successor, had come along with them, and he was there so they can consult with him. And Yerovam came to the Navi and asked him what to do. And Elisha responded over here to the king. He responded to the king of Israel, Mali walach el neviei mecha avicha we el neviei mecha. What do I have to do with you? Lech, sorry, I left out this word. Lech, go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother. Consult with them. Now, Radak says that the prophets of your father is talking about Ahab's prophets of the Baal. And I don't think that's shot here for two reasons. One, if it was the prophets of the Baal, that was certainly the prophets of his mother. He could have just said, Lech el neviei avicha v'imecha. Go to the prophets of your father and your mother. But here he distinguishes between the prophets of your father and the prophets of his mother, which means that there are different groups. And indeed, we see that Ahab perhaps was not the most enthusiastic follower of the Baal if it was only his wife's fault. His wife was much more inclined to it. Ahab apparently did not object when Eliyahu conducted a massacre, a mass slaughter of the prophets and priests of the Baal after the miracle at Mount Carmel. And it was Jezebel, Ahab's wicked wife, who then threatened Eliyahu's life, had to send him into hiding again. And it was Jezebel who was basically the patron of the Baal worship after that. So when it says Nevi'ei Avicha, it's referring to these 400 false prophets who, at the very least, the ones we read about here, Ahab's false prophets who at least speak in the name of God. Basically, there's a few ways that someone could be a false prophet. The main way is for someone to be prophesying in the name of a non-God, anybody but the one true God. That's certainly a false prophet. And then you have the trickier ones who look like true prophets and they prophesize in our God's name, but they are false. They're yes men, etc. Pe'echad. So that's what this references to. And Nevi'ei Amecha is the Jezebel's prophets of the Baal, because that's what she had. She didn't have any true prophets. She was the one that says, by the way, Ovadiah had to hide true prophets in the cave, 50 men in a cave. Why? Because it was Jezebel who was the one who was busy trying to kill the real prophets, the ones who prophesied in God's name. Whereas Ahab doesn't say that he was involved in that. Yeah, he let his wife perhaps do it, but we all know who was really running the show there. And finally, about these false prophets, we get to the book of Nehemiah. And here we have it that Nehemiah was basically being threatened by Palestinian terrorists and the Palestinian Authority at the time. They were called the Samaritans and other occupying groups. When the Jewish people came back from exile, they found that basically the people on the coast, what they call the remnants of the Philistines and other sea peoples who had invaded, were basically making inroads. They had taken over more territory along the coast. The people who lived in the north, the Samaritans, the Kuthian imports, who had taken the place of the 10 tribes, mostly Ephraim and Manasseh, had also taken over large parts of territory. And the Edomians, the Bnei Esav, had moved in more into the south of the land of Israel, even going as far as Hebron. Well, they had a problem with these people. They wanted to first thwart the rebuilding of the temple, and they wanted to stop Nehemiah from his religious reforms. By reforms, I mean strengthening traditional Jewish observance and also making sure that Jerusalem was a nice fortified city. These are things they all tried to stop. And it says here that this Shemaiah ben Delaiah, son of Mehetavel, that's a name common. Apparently, we find them among the Edomians and also among the Egyptians, this name. And he was tied up at the time. He said, let's go meet in the house of God. Let's go to the temple. We should even meet in there in the Kodesh, because it's the safest place where people would find us. We should close the doors of the temple because they're coming to get you. And Nehemiah objected. He said, what kind of person like me would flee? And how can I even go into the Heichal and live? One, the fact that I would run beyond the run is not appropriate for a person of my stature. And also, I don't think it's the right place to go. And then he says, I realized it wasn't God who had sent him. He was prophesying, but he was basically on the payroll from Tovia, Tobias, one of these the main Palestinian terrorist at the time, in Sanballat, the number two. Geshem the Aravi is also mentioned, or Gashmu as he's known. He's the number three. And it says he was basically paid to do this. So I didn't listen to them. And then he says over here, he prays to God, remember what Tovia and Sanballat were trying to do to me. And Noadia Haneviyah letar Nevi'im. This Noadia, the prophetess. Yes, prophets come in male and female, just like they're true prophets of God who are also women, prophetesses. So too, you have false women prophets, just like you have false men prophets. They were trying to scare Nehemiah at the time, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why the institution of the prophethood basically died in this era. There were too many false prophets. It was a problem. Yes, there are advantages to having prophecy, but eventually, when there's so many false ones, it just stopped happening. Such that in Maccabean times, early Mishnaic times, they were basically thinking, well, it's been a few hundred years since a prophet showed up, but it's nothing new. In the times of the judges, also prophets were not that common. You could go a century or two without a Navi. But eventually they realized, oh, they're just not coming back. Perhaps that's what God wants. And the last thing we have here is how another enactment that was made in Nehemiah's days was that certain families would be in charge of bringing firewood to the temple on a regular basis. This is mentioned in Masechet Tanit. The families that did this on a regular basis had their day of the year when they brought the wood to the temple, and they continued to observe these days as family holidays even after the destruction of the temple. Perhaps they were waiting for the temple to be hastily rebuilt so they could get back to doing this great mitzvah. And he talks about all the other things that they took upon themselves to make sure to always give their tithes, donations to the poor, and of course, their donations to upkeep the temple. And he says, and we shall not abandon the house of our God. And then he says, Vayishavu Sarei Ha'am Yerushalayim. The big shots of the people, they lived in Jerusalem. Ushar Ha'am, but the rest of the people, he pilu gorelot lavi echad min Asarel shevet Yerushalayim ira kodesh. The rest of the people took lots, or they had a lottery basically, deciding that yes, they'd resell the land, they had rebuilt their cities, their towns. It was significant, but there were not enough people living in Jerusalem. They needed to up the population of Jerusalem, so they basically wanted to conscript people. One out of every 10 men had to pick up and move to Jerusalem and bring his family with them in order to settle the place. So 9 out of 10 were able to stay in their own cities. The people blessed those who just decided to volunteer. They didn't have to conscript certain people. They volunteered to be the 1 out of 10. You check this, you're not supposed to count Jews, but those who are counting Jews know that about 1/10 of Israel's Jewish population, at least for the last decade, lives in Jerusalem, which is a good thing because we need to hold on to these places. Basically, if we abandon places like the house of our God, we don't go there ourselves, we're not there, then it'll be occupied by people like this Sanballat, the Choroni, and Tovia, the Samaritan, and Geshem the Aravi, these unfriendlies, these hostile subterrestrial people. We have to watch out for them. And that's why I believe it's very important now. I'm calling upon everybody. I'm going to do this myself. Today is Lag BaOmer. So for whatever reason, my normal responsibilities tomorrow morning, at least until about 9 o'clock, I don't have them. So I have a chance to go to the temple first thing tomorrow morning, and I intend to do so. I'm also trying to take upon myself B'li Neder every single day when I have off from whatever normal work responsibilities, etc., and Torah study and teaching responsibilities, but that may be, to make sure to go to the temple first thing in the morning. We haven't gone enough. I didn't realize I could have gone on Israeli Independence Day. I thought the temple was closed. I didn't see the messages. Thank God. I don't check the messages all the time, but apparently they reopened it by then. And tomorrow morning is Lag BaOmer. There's nothing much to do. It's not really a holiday anyways. I mean, what else do you do in Lag BaOmer? I don't even know why they're skipping Tachnun. So that is when I intend to go. And I invite you to join me because as we see from Nehemiah, we have to keep our connection and our hold on the temple. Because if not, we're just giving it away to these unsavory characters and the false prophets. The false prophets who are yes men to the regime that is trying to keep us away from the temple. The false prophets who are siding with our enemies, who are basically would be happy to see Jerusalem not be Jewish Jerusalem anymore. And I guess we'll stop it for there because that's all the passages we have now. And I'm going to check if we have any questions. Hold on, I don't think we got any. No, any questions there? Okay, good. So I don't see the chat also. Hold on, one more second. I don't know where the chat is. Okay, so we're good to go. We didn't get any questions on the WhatsApp this time. And I'd like to wish everybody a safe and uneventful Lag BaOmer. Don't forget your fire extinguishers. Keep them nearby. You don't know when you could save a life. And you could send your questions or comments. Like, share, subscribe, share it with your friends. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Be well.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.